Walser. Walser was an unbeliever. In fact, he was a member of an unbelieving community, the free thinking community. And he decided he was going to prove once and for all to the world that unbelief was a much better system than Christianity and then believing in God. And so he went to Missouri and he started a town that he named Liberal, Missouri. And there in Liberal, Missouri, he said, as a charter member, if you're going to come into this city, here are the rules. You cannot believe in God. You cannot believe in heaven. You cannot believe in hell. You can't believe in anything spiritual, because here was his thought. His thought was that if you apply all your energy to the here and now, to the physical, and don't waste your time on religious thinking and ideas about God and heaven and hell, then you will be more productive. And his stated purpose was to show the world that a society of unbelievers is the best possible society that you can have. In fact, he was suggesting that up to this point, the reason that basically cultures and the reason that cities in the United States of America weren't doing what they needed to do was just because you had too many believers in it. And if you could just get all the people who believe in God out and basically distill it down to unbelief, then you would get the perfect society. And so he started Liberal, Missouri. How do you think that went? Well, there was a man by the name of Clark Braden in 1885. After 5 years of Liberal going strong, he went in. His name was Clark Braden. Clark Braden had delivered over 3,000 lectures. He had been in over, I think, 115 or so debates. And as I understand it, I think he was a member of the Fourth Church, if I understand correctly. I don't have all of his exact history, but he went into Liberal, Missouri, and he was going to determine what the situation was. And he wrote an article about Liberal, Missouri. You can go to Liberal now. I have taken these pictures myself when I was out lecturing around that area. This is Liberal, Missouri. Population is 779. I always think those population signs are interesting. You know, how long do they stay up if a person moves in or if someone moves out? Or I always think that they can only be accurate for about 1 day or so if a child is born in Liberal, Missouri. But you can see the names of the street signs. Darwin Drive, Robert Ingersoll Lane for the infidel Robert Ingersoll. And this is Liberal, Missouri, of course, not the one in 1885, but it still has a hint of what was going on there. And so Clark Braden wrote an article titled An Infidel Experiment in 1885 in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Now, we have called the county seat or whatever it is there that houses this type of information, and this is an exact copy of the 1885 article we had in our offices. And basically, in 1885, Clark Braden said, I spent some time in Liberal. And here's what I found out. The hotels are basically brothels. The boast and the claim that nobody gets drunk in Liberal, Missouri is false as false can be. He said you will see more drunken infidels in Liberal, Missouri in a year than you will see basically ever in any city the likes of which is outside of Liberal, Missouri. He said everybody curses, including the women and the children. He said the children don't mind the adults at all. He said it is a cesspool of human immorality, and the people who have gone there wish they could leave, but their property value has sunk so low that they can't even sell their places to get out. Well, the people in Liberal didn't take this kindly, and so they prosecuted Clark Braden for criminal libel. Well, within just a few days, the criminal suit was thrown out, but another one of the people who owned one of the hotels who said that Clark Braden's statements had caused him serious financial troubles and the ruin of his hotel, is how he worded it, sued him in a civil suit for $25,000. And in 1885, $25,000 was a considerable sum of money. But when he found out that Clark Braden had documentation for everything that he had said, and that he was prepared to defend himself with that documentation from things he had gotten from the city, well, he dismissed the lawsuit, and he had to pay all of the court costs and various costs associated with suing Clark Braden, because he was basically scared that Braden was going to actually show people what he had said was the case. Now, here's what's interesting. If you go to Liberal, Missouri, it's the oddest situation of a burial in the cemetery that I've ever seen. And what I mean by that is there's one place in the center of the huge cemetery. Well, it's not huge. It has a few hundred graves there. But in the center, George Walzer had reserved a place because he initially wanted to be buried in Liberal with all of his fellow infidels, because, of course, he was claiming that once you're dead, and that your body is all that's left, and there's no spirit, no soul, no heaven, no hell, etc. But George Walzer, the founder of Liberal, Missouri, after trying the infidel experiment, realized he was wrong. Absolutely wrong. And when you go to Liberal, Missouri, that place that was reserved for George Walzer is empty. There's no one buried there because George Walzer had moved to Lamar, Missouri, after his attempt to prove to the world that infidelism was a better idea. And George Walzer is buried in Lamar, Missouri, because he came in contact with the teachings of Jesus after his infidel experiment and realized he had been totally wrong. Everything he had thought was absolutely, positively incorrect, and he wanted out of Liberal, Missouri, and didn't want to have anything to do with being buried among the rest of the infidels there. You know, what happens when a person puts into practice the ideas of unbelief and atheism? I mean, that's what we're going to be looking at, the fruits of atheism, the implications of atheism. When you believe a certain thing and then you act on that belief, what then occurs? Well, before you do that, it's interesting, I think, to look at the idea of the fruits of Christianity. Now, this statement is written by a man named Bertrand Russell in an essay titled Ideas That Have Helped Mankind. But here's what's interesting about Bertrand Russell. He also has an essay titled Why I'm Not a Christian. He is not a friend of Christianity in any shape, form, or fashion. He doesn't believe in Christianity, doesn't believe in Jesus, doesn't believe in heaven or hell or God or anything like that. He's just saying, historically, when you look at what happens in Christianity, here's what occurs when the belief goes into a culture. When people start believing that Jesus really is the Son of God, and that there is a God, and that there is a heaven, and that there is a hell, this is what happens. And here's what he says. Christianity, as soon as it conquered the state, and now there he's talking, of course, about Rome. As soon as it conquered Rome, the belief system did, it put an end to gladiatorial shows. Not because they were cruel, but because they were idolatrous. The result, however, was to diminish the widespread education and cruelty by which the populace of Roman towns were degraded. Christianity also did much to soften the lot of slaves. It established charity on a large scale, and it inaugurated hospitals. Although the great majority of Christians failed mentally in Christian charity, the ideal remained alive, and in every age inspired some notable saints. In a new form, it passed over modern liberalism and remains the inspiration of much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Okay, Bertrand Russell has an essay titled Why I'm Not a Christian. But he says, look, the Christianity text, number one, it stopped all the senseless killing and the gladiatorial shows. Number two, it inaugurated hospitals, basically nationwide. And it established charity on a large scale. It did much to soften a lot of slaves, because if you go into a culture and you really apply doing to others as you want them to do to you, then your life drastically changes from what you had been doing. And he said, even in our modern times, it remains the inspiration behind much that is most hopeful in our somber world. He says, I don't believe in Christianity, but let me tell you what happens when people start acting like Christians. Things are better. The society improves. Everybody has a better situation. There is charity on a large scale. Hospitals to take care of the sick. There are things that change to make life better for people. Now think about it. Imagine, if you will, a society where everybody acted like Christ told us to act. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself, according to Philippians chapter 2. Love one another. By this will all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Let every one of us do to others as we would want them to do to us. Forgive each other. Be tender-hearted with brotherly love, considering one another, stirring one another up to good works. What would a church be like where there was no gossip, no envy, no jealousy, no selfish ambition, but a concern and love for others that put other people's needs in front of our own? Would you want to be a member of a society like that? I mean, can you imagine that would be heaven on earth as much as you could possibly get? And what Bertrand Russell is admitting is, if people act like Christians, well, the place is better. Everything's better. Now, let's stop right here and say, do some people call themselves Christians and not act like it? Oh, absolutely positively. The word hypocrite is when someone puts a false face on them, when they say they are something and they're not that thing. The Crusades, and lots of times when you talk to Muslims about being Christians and about the validity and the truth of Christianity, they will say, well, Jesus Christ wasn't a loving person. And you then say, well, why? Why would you say that? And they'll say because of the Crusades and the Christians who, in the 1100 AD came over, the 1060 AD or so, came over and killed so many of our people to take back the land. Okay, did Jesus ever, in all of his teaching while he was on this earth, support any type of physical violence against another person? In fact, no, you'll see Jesus standing before Pilate, and Pilate says, so you're a king then? And Jesus says, yeah, I'm a king, but not like you think. I'm not a king that has a physical army. He said, because if I was a king like that, my people would fight. But I'm not a king like that. That's not the kingdom that I am ruling. And basically he said, if I was a king like that, my people would fight. We'd always win. But that's not how we approach this war between good and evil. It's not physical, and you don't go and kill people like that. Do people act not like Christians, even though they sometimes call themselves Christians? Absolutely, positively. The Salem witch trials. Lots of times the skeptics will look at us as Christians and say, well, you're responsible for the Salem witch trials. Those people were calling themselves Christians. Sure they were. But were they acting like Christ? No, not in any way. In fact, you and I both know and have seen people who on Saturday nights will be involved in any type of drunkenness and partying and sin and sexual promiscuity, but then sometimes on a Sunday morning they'll be standing up and leading the prayers and waiting on the table. And you think about that and you think, well, hold on just a second. You're not putting your Christianity into practice. Okay, yeah. Some people call themselves Christians and don't put that belief into practice. But you can't blame Christ for someone not putting the belief of Christianity into practice. If you're going to test the validity of Christianity, you have to test it at its base, at its core, at its internal element of what did Jesus say do. And what Jesus said do would bring about the greatest possible benefit to everybody involved in a society where people were acting like Christians. Now then, can people claim atheism and not act like an atheist? You see, what I mean by that is that there are certain beliefs that attach to atheism. There are implications of that belief. If you were to go to Psalm chapter 14 and verse 1, the Bible will tell you the fool has said in his heart there is no God. No, that's a fairly famous verse, and what I mean by famous is lots of people know it. If you're anything like me, you probably don't know where it's found. I don't do well with chapters and verses lots of times, but you know it's in there. And so the fool has said in his heart there is no God. But most of the time we don't go to the next couple verses where the text says they are corrupt, they have done abominable things, there is none who does good, no, not one. Well, what's the text saying? The text is saying, okay, if you take that idea of unbelief and you put it into practice, if you really think that there's no God, which means then you also think that there is no heaven or hell, and that means you also think that there's ultimately no moral standard and that humans just make up the rules as they go, and you put that into practice, then you get a society like Whittle, Missouri, that is full of immorality and horrible, terrible things that happen to people in that society. So what I'd like to suggest is most people that don't believe in God aren't acting like atheists. They're acting like kind of halfway Christian, halfway atheists that claim to believe that there's no God, claim to believe that there is no heaven or hell, no soul or spirit, but they're not putting their atheism into practice. Because what we're going to see this morning is if you put atheism into practice, it's not just a belief. It's a system of immorality that would degrade any society to the level of basically humans becoming animals. And you don't have to take my word for that. We will look at that statement. William Proline, who was a biologist that taught at Cornell University, he said Charles Darwin, as he was formulating this idea of giving the world and now put this in quotations because we looked at this all weekend, but giving the world a plausible way to believe that there's no God, his evolution. He said Charles Darwin knew that when he said humans evolved from lower life forms, that was going to change the philosophy of what a human is. And he said he knew that this meant that there are no gods worth having, that there's no life after death, there's no ultimate foundation for ethics, and no ultimate meaning in life. He said Charles Darwin knew this very well, that if you really believe that humans evolved from animals, at what point do you say this is a human and this is an animal? Well, ultimately, he said there's no point that you can divide humans from animals. And so he said there's no meaning in life, no ultimate foundation for ethics. And let's look at that idea right there. No ultimate foundation for ethics. Now, ethics is basically just understanding if some things are right, some things are wrong, and understanding what is right and wrong. Well, if there's no God, and you are a product of accidental processes over 13.8 billion years, where does the idea that something is right or wrong originate? And who says your idea of right and wrong is better than my idea of right and wrong? And so Charles Darwin said, hey, a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those instincts and impulses which are the strongest or which seem to him to be the best ones. He says, let's say you don't believe there's a soul. You don't believe there's a spirit. You don't believe there's a God, not a heaven, not a hell. Then how do you make decisions about what you should do? Now let's look at that word should. Not what you feel like doing. Not what you think is the right thing to do or the wrong thing, but what you should do. This is something that ought to be done. I don't want to do it. Ought. Basically says there's no should. Do something. You arrive at the scene. You assess what will make you feel the best or what you think is the strongest instinct that you've got, and you do it. And that's as right as we can call right, but you can't really call anything right. Okay, you go to a steak place. You order a 16-ounce T-bone. The little guy next to you who weighs 120 pounds orders an 8-ounce sirloin. You get your T-bone. It looks like about an 8 ounce. It's not cooked right. You look over at this little 120-pound guy's plate. It looks like he's got a 24-ounce porterhouse on his plate. You walk over to him because you're hungrier than he is and you're bigger than he is, and you say to him, "Give me your steak." And he says, "No, I'm not giving you my steak. I ordered this. It's the one that brought me." You say, "Yeah, but I'm bigger than you and I'm hungrier than you and I want your steak." He says, "No, I'm not giving you my steak." So you punch him in the face because you feel like it, and you take it. Now, according to Charles Darwin, if that was your strongest instinct, did you do anything wrong? Well, no, you didn't do anything wrong because there's no foundation for ethics. You can't say this. You can say, "Hey, we don't want a society where people do that, so I'm going to put a policeman in the restaurant so that if that happens to me, I'll get to eat my steak," etc. No, that's not the question. Did you do something wrong? You understand that without a God, you can't say that anybody does anything morally wrong. Because where would you get a moral rule that would apply to everyone across every regional boundary or barrier in every country? Where do you get that? Well, you can only get it from one place, and that's a higher authority. And if there's no higher authority, then what you believe is right. It's just as good as what I believe is right. And if you think it's right to steal somebody's steak, but I don't, well, it doesn't matter. We're all just right, or we're all just wrong, but there's not really a concept of either one of them. And so, then Margaret said, there are no actions in and of themselves that are always 2009. He is the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's a large, unbelievable organization in Madison, Wisconsin. In fact, if I understand it right, in the United States, it's the largest one that there is. I think they have about 18,000 people on their roll. As I was reading his literature and listened to the debate he had with a man named Peter Payne, I thought to myself, if I can get him to flesh this idea out and say it more clearly, then the unbelieving community will be appalled at the implication of that and will turn their back on him and distance themselves from him as much as possible. That's how naive I was, I guess, in 2009. And so, in this debate, a student had come up to the stand, the microphone, and asked Danny Barker, he said, okay, you said all actions, in and of themselves, there's not an action that can be called morally wrong. He said, okay, when would it be right to rape a person? And Dan Barker said, it's so unusual, but if aliens came down and said you have to do that in order to save all of humankind, then that would be your moral obligation. You would have to do that. Okay, so fast forward to 2009, 4 years later after that debate, I said, you said this in the Peter Payne debate. What about 2 people? He said, yes, you would have to do that to save all of humankind. I said, what about 2,000? He said, yes. I said, what about 2 million? He said, yeah. To save all of humankind, yes, that would be your moral obligation to do to 2 million people. You see where that's going? Well, what about 2 billion? If you did that to 2 billion people, but you were saving the other 5 billion. You see, as long as you just make up the rules yourself, then there really is nothing absolutely morally right or wrong. And so I thought, if I can get him to say that in public, well, that's game over. No. In fact, the atheists that were in the audience and the people who watched the debate basically had not one problem with that statement whatsoever. Because they don't act like unbelievers. They don't put it into practice. And in fact, as he was standing on the stage, he said, that would cause me terrible guilt. I would feel terrible if I did it, but it would be my moral obligation. Okay, so you're not acting like an unbeliever. You're not putting your unbelief into practice, because if you did, that shouldn't cause you a problem at all. It shouldn't be any worry to you whatsoever. If you believe that that's the moral thing that you should do, then that's just something. You see, what we're saying is the implication of unbelief is that. But if people acted like that, really, we would quickly see the disconnect between this belief of atheism and saying, what we're taught is, he's got a book titled Your Friendly Neighborhood Atheist, where he says, lots of times you talk to an atheist, they're very friendly, they're very nice, and that's true. You go down the street and there's somebody who doesn't believe in God, this person is highly moral, and they are kind, and they are polite, and they invite you in, and okay, can you be an unbeliever without acting like one? Absolutely, positively. But does the belief system of atheism lead to grotesque immorality? Yes. And that's why in Psalm 14:1, the Bible says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And then it starts listing, there is none who does good. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. Because the belief system itself is morally depraved. As you continue with this line of thinking, where would you get the idea that it would be all right to kill an unborn child? Now, you would never get that from the Bible, and here are a number of reasons why. Number one, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where do you get the value of being a human? Well, from your Creator. It's given to you because at the beginning, God created male and female in His own image. And from the very beginning of the Old Testament to the very end of the New Testament, God recognizes all human life as valuable, not because of how fast somebody can run, not because of how intelligent they are, or how handsome or beautiful they happen to be. Every single person is valuable for a single reason. God made them, and He made them different from every other created thing in the world, because He made them in His own image, with the ability to reason, with the freedom to choose, and with an immortal soul that once it is created will never die. And that happens at conception. And at conception, from the biblical standpoint, every human is valued above now listen to this, the entirety of the physical universe. Now I'm going to repeat this, so you understand what I'm trying to say? Every human is valued above the entirety of the physical universe. That means your soul, your singular personality is worth more than all the gold in Fort Knox. It's worth more than all the oil underneath any place in Texas or Alaska. Your singular soul. What will a man give in exchange for his soul? Well, if you possess the entire world, would you give the entire physical world for your soul? Yes. You know, every single child is more valuable than the entirety of the physical universe. And yet, along the way, somehow, people have decided that we're going to not treat unborn babies like they're humans. Well, where would you get the idea that that would be morally permissible? You couldn't get it from the Bible. You know, the same words that are used for babies that are unborn in the Bible are used for babies that are born in the Bible. What I mean by that is when Mary goes to Elizabeth and John is in Elizabeth's womb, and the text says that John, the baby, leaped inside of her. Well, that same word talking about John as a child in his mother's womb is the word that's used for Jesus after Jesus is born and he's in the manger. So the Bible is recognizing the unborn child just as valuable as the child that is born. A person is a person, no matter how small. Well, where would you get the idea that abortion would be an all right thing to do? Charles Darwin said, you know, there's no fundamental difference between man and higher mammals in their mental faculties. Now stop right there. If there's no God and you're the product of blind random chance process over millions of years, and so is a chimpanzee, then what separates you from the chimpanzee? He says, there's nothing fundamentally different about you and the chimpanzee other than you happen to be smarter. Okay. Well, what if you're not? You say, okay, I quit being silly. Of course, we're all smarter than the chimpanzee. Okay, what if you have a human that is not processing information? They have a problem with their brain. They have a disability, a severe disability. You see, basically, he's saying, okay, if you're right here and your wife is right here, and your wife's IQ is higher than yours, which is the case for a lot of us, well, then you're just a little less intelligent than your wife. But if the chimpanzee is sitting over here by you, then the chimpanzee is just less intelligent than you. It's just a degree of intelligence. It's not a different kind of intelligence. And so then if you went down the spectrum and you had a physically or very mentally disabled person that wasn't even able to cognitively function at the level of a chimpanzee, then which one would be more valuable? Well, as you continue, you don't have to have me spell that out for you. But listen to Barbara Burke as she writes about this idea of abortion and evolution. Among some animal species, infant killing appears to be a natural practice. It could be natural for humans too, a trait inherited from our primate ancestors. Charles Darwin noted in The Descent of Man that infanticide is then, quote, probably the most important of all checks on population growth throughout most of human history. She said, okay, if you're this animal, and animals kill their babies, then why don't we just say humans do too, and that keeps the population there? You know, the Komodo dragon, baby Komodo dragons can climb trees, adults can't. You know why that is? Because 10% of the adult Komodo dragon diet is baby Komodo dragons. And they lay their eggs, and then if they see a baby Komodo dragon running around and they can catch it, they eat it. Well, are they doing something morally wrong? You know, an adult Komodo dragon eats its baby, that just has to have a baby, he's doing something wrong. You know, we would say, no, it's just a Komodo dragon. It's just an animal. That's just what they do. Well, then Barbara Burke is saying, okay, well, you're just an animal. So that's just what you do. But you know, there's something we know. No, we're not. We are not. animals. There's something fundamentally different. It's not a degree of difference. It's a fundamental difference. It's a different kind of intelligence. It's a different kind of existence. It's a different kind of being. I'm not just smarter than a Komodo dragon. I'm different from a Komodo dragon. I'm not just smarter than a tree. I'm different from a tree. I'm a human. And being a human, regardless of how intelligent I am, regardless of how fast I am, regardless of how pretty or handsome I am, makes me important for no other reason than I was made in God's image. But if you throw out God, you then jettison the idea that humans have inherent value. And that's a fact. Now, if there is a God, and there is, and that's what we've been made to doubt all weekend, then you quickly begin to realize what a debased system unbelief brings in. A debased thinking philosophy. Peter Singer says this. He is an atheistic ethicist, which I find to be an oxymoron. He basically is a person who says there's no God, but I'm going to help you understand what's right and wrong. Richard Dawkins, who is recognized as the world's leading atheist probably in the world, says of Peter Singer that he's the most moral individual that he's ever met. There's a little YouTube video where they're dialoguing back and forth, and Richard Dawkins is talking to Singer, and he says, Singer, you're the most moral individual I've ever met. And Peter Singer puts forward this idea. He says, you know, if we compare a severely defective human animal with a non-human animal, a dog or pig, for example, we'll often find the non-human to have superior capacity. Only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently from the dog or pig. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. He said, you know what, in the past, you'd have maybe a German Shepherd that could be born and be a very valuable drug dog. But then over here, you'd have a baby, a human baby, that was going to be born, but as you look into it, it looks like it's going to have some severe disabilities. And we've always said, look, if you got to pick one of these two, you always pick the baby. And why do you pick the baby? He said, because it's human. But he says, species membership is not morally relevant. He said, if you're an atheist and you believe humans evolved from lower animals and are just animals, then for centuries we've kept the human because it was human. But what makes the human any more important than the German Shepherd? Look, there's no God, nothing makes it any more important than the German Shepherd. He said, if we can put aside this obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of our human life, we might can start looking at life like it really is. Well, what do you mean by that, Peter? Nevertheless, the main point is clear. Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. In fact, very often it's not wrong at all. You know, if that German Shepherd he's saying is going to be a better drug dog than having to put resources into a child that's going to be disabled for his whole life or her whole life, then look, let's keep the German Shepherd, let's replace the child, and that's the word he uses, replace the child. Because, hey, that's going to be better for society. Now listen, this is not put into practice on a regular basis, but the atheistic community wants you to think that unbelief is a harmless idea, that it's just an intellectual pursuit, that it doesn't really matter if you believe in God or not. We all act the same. We're all trying to do the same stuff. Everybody's trying to be morally right, and it's just one of those beliefs that, you know, academically we're different, but we're really all the same. But listen, that is not what's happening here. When a society adopts the idea that there's no God, immediately the value of human life goes out the window. And then, if I had time to show you, which I don't, then the responsibility for your own actions goes out the window, because look, if there's no God and there's no soul, then what's making you do what you do? Well, just the chemicals banging around in your brain. So when somebody goes out and murders several people, hey, it's not their fault. It just happens that their chemicals are kind of messed up. And so you don't punish people. Nobody's morally responsible for anything. And you lose the idea of the freedom of human will. You also then lose the idea of any type of legitimate punishment for things you've done wrong. You then, as a culture, cannot deal with guilt, which everybody has when they do something wrong, but there's nothing to deal with it from an atheistic proposition or point of view. And that could be hammered out. We'll continue along these lines. James Rachels, who taught at the University of Alabama, as I understand, he wrote a book titled Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. Now, stop right there and I'll read this and then let's deal with this idea of implication. And if it was severe brain damage, even if it survives for many years, may never learn to speak, its mental powers may never rise above the primitive level. In fact, its psychological capacities may be markedly inferior to those of a typical rhesus monkey. In that case, moral individualism would see no reason to prefer its life over monkeys. Okay, James Rushing, well, what do you think we should do with it? Some unfortunate humans, perhaps because they've suffered brain damage, they're not rational agents. What are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we're considering, would be that their status is that of mere animals, and perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals, are used perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food. Can you believe that someone can write that statement and maintain his teaching position at a university in our country? That a person can say, you know what, sometimes if you just relegate people to a non-person status because they're not smart enough, then you can do whatever you want to with them, just like you do with an animal. You know what I find so very interesting was I was just listening to a book on tape about the Nazi regime as it was rising to power, and the person who was writing about it, he was the U.S. diplomat to Berlin in the 1930s, 33, 34, 35. His name was William Dodd. And he said there's something so ironic going on in the nation of Germany. He said the people are scared to move, they are scared to talk, they are being beaten for no reason, they're being thrown in prison. It was just after the night of the long knives where Hitler had gone in and shot over 100 people or so in cold blood, half of them shot in the back, running away, etc. But he said the dogs and the horses are so well taken care of. He said it is a crime to do anything negative to a dog, and so the German shepherds. He said you've got dogs that are not afraid of people whatsoever. You've got horses that are fat and happy. He said it would be better in Nazi Germany to be a horse than to be a person. Because they had taken this idea of relegating humans to subhuman status with the Jewish nation that had virtually taken over their society. Well, I don't have time to continue. Well, I guess I'll finish it, please. In 2006, the distinguished Texas scientist of the year, his name was Eric Pionka. Eric Pionka was a scientist who studied reptiles, and he believed that his reptiles were more important than most people, as I understand his personality. And he was delivering this speech at the 109th meeting of the Texas Academy of Sciences in March of that year. And as this story is represented to us from people who were there, he went over to the person who was filming the speech that he was about to give and told the person doing the camera not to film what he was about to say. He said that people just weren't ready to hear it, although it was true. He then stood up and said, the problem with our world is people. And what we need to do is eliminate 90% of the human population. And he said, a good, viable way to do that would be have something like an airborne Ebola virus that would quickly kill 90% of the population in 3 or 4 days, then it can be cleaned up, etc. And that would be the best possible situation for our ecosystem and our world. The man said, let's kill 9 out of 10 people as the Texas Scientist of the Year. Now, what you wish had happened was that the 400 educators there would have stood up and walked out, booed him. Someone would have stood up and corrected this type of thinking and said, that does not represent what we believe down here in Texas. That does not represent what we are trying to teach in the science classes. No, that's not what they did. They gave him a standing ovation. And on one of the Facebook posts later, one of the students who was there, the science educator students, wrote, hey, that Dr. Bianchi is a radical, isn't he? He's basically advocating for the death of 90% of all the human population. And at the risk of sounding just as radical, I completely agree with him. You know, it's all something. To say, you know, we're just dealing ideas here, and this is not that big of a deal. You believe this, I believe that. But no, that's not how this works. beliefs put into practice have fruits. And you judge those fruits by the implications of those beliefs. There is a God. You're created in God's image. You're morally responsible, and you're inherently valuable. Those beliefs have implications. There is no God. You're here by accident. There are no moral absolutes, and there's no meaning or value to this life. Those beliefs have implications. They're false and dangerous, and if adopted by society, will end up looking like liberal Missouri. And what's the solution to that? Well, the solution to that is to recognize the validity and truth that there is a God, and recognize that you're created in God's image, and that everything that you do matters, and that you have meaning in your life, and that you are important for no other reason than that God created you in His image, and He put you here by design, on purpose, to fulfill a work that only you can do at this time in human history, and He's got something for you to do, and what you do really matters. Do you believe that? Well, I think maybe even a better statement would be, not only do you believe that, but are you putting it into practice? Let's all act like we know there's a God, and that Jesus Christ is our Savior, and that He died on the cross for us, and that we have meaning in our lives. You see, I believe if we start putting Christianity into real practice, the world will have to take notice. And Jesus said just the same, didn't He? When He said that they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Thank you for listening. Appreciate you. Well, you wait until I finish the ring the bell.